The language of a panentheistic turn was coined by Phil Clayton. Okay, Phil Clayton, you all, I would assume, know. And panentheism, I want to focus on this a little bit because, again, we're going a little bit wider, because panentheism has been a significant influence in the modern discussion of theology. So Clayton said there's been a panentheistic turn. Michael Brearley has called panentheism a silent revolution, even though it's not so silent anymore. And David Ray Griffin even calls panentheism a postmodern revelation. Its language of revelation is interesting. Okay, and following this, he says, although people have often been led to believe that they must choose among only three options, right? Maybe traditional theism, pantheism, and atheism, there's a fully distinct fourth alternative, panentheism, which an increasing number of thinkers are finding more satisfactory. So one question, I suppose, that follows from this is, well, why, right? What are the reasons, I suppose, that people are finding either process panentheism or panentheisms more generally to be more satisfying? And I thought it'd be good for us, again, speaking more broadly, to look at a couple of these reasons and how an image of God can help in a deep sense. And I pulled these from my recent book with Philip Clayton, where we situated spiritual journeys within this panentheistic turn. This is a monkfish book in New York publisher, published in 2018. And it's a really interesting context of personal spiritual journeys that are arriving at something like this panentheistic vision. Okay, so let's look briefly at these. Okay, so some have arrived to this vision because they perceive inadequacies, obviously, with classical theism. We've already sort of seen this in a different way. They might see classical or supernatural theism as no longer being viable in a deep sense. We were sort of speaking about that. And it may be that atheism really has become this more convincing answer, okay? And they've argued that panentheism offers more of a compelling vision, okay, of the divine without these deep problems raised by, it might be naive forms of theism or very quick proclamations of atheism, right? Like the move, for example, of classical theism is not true, therefore atheism is. That's a quick move, right? There's a lot of different understandings of God that should be investigated in the conversation. Okay, two would be that panentheism has arguably been compatible, more compatible, it is argued, with certain insights across scientific disciplines. Okay, so people are insisting that whether it's physics or biology, or common features across these disciplines, structures of evolutionary emergence, for example, that panentheism has a certain way of arguably understanding God's relation in relation to these realities. Okay, continues to be at the center of science-religion discussion. Okay, Philip Clayton has certainly pioneered that discussion in a serious way. Questions of theistic evolution, right? Think about the question of power. Why do we have an evolutionary process of inconceivable time if God could have created the world in one omnipotent boom? Process thinkers tend to say that the evolutionary process is revealing. It seems to suggest that God works patiently, persuasively with the world. Okay, the element of quantum physics too, these are all been a part of the discussion where panentheism might have an important place for somebody returning or rethinking the reality of God. Okay, so I've argued that panentheism is entailed by certain metaphysical convictions. Okay, right? If you're committed to a certain metaphysical framework, a way of viewing the nature of reality, you may or may not be in the domain of an inherently panentheistic vision, right? Idealisms, right? Those philosophies which see mind as fundamental, non-dualisms across the traditions, mysticisms, okay, and process philosophy, all of which have this very intimate relationship between God and the world. It's not so clear that it's a hierarchy or a dualism, right? It's a non-dual sort of understanding. Okay, and at least some of these traditions see God as eternal in nature, but God develops as well in and through the relationship with the world. All right, so these are sort of parsed out issues that are tedious in some sense. Okay, some have argued more that panentheism has an more adequate preservation of religious beliefs. Okay, for example, we have revelation, this notion of revelation, incarnation, sacramental awareness, religious or mystical experience. I mean, to have these experiences in some sense assumes that the relationship God has to the world is one of intimate communion, companionship, as Whitehead states. So this vision of the world in God also has allowed for ideas of divine action that avoid the notion of intervention, right? Because after all, if the world is in God in some deep sense, there's nothing outside in a way. You can't intervene from the outside in. Rather, God's working with the world is fundamental to the God-world relationship itself. And certainly for process thinkers, this has been the heart of what David Ray Griffin called Whitehead's naturalistic theism. God and the world are naturally related in a deep sense. So there's no exterior interventions. Where would it come from? It's immanent. It's flooding the world from within. All right, some have also said that panentheism is a mediating metaphysic between East and West. Okay? It forms a kind of bridge between Eastern and Western religious systems. Okay, they've argued additionally that it's a better framework for thinking about interreligious dialogue, and arguably a pluralistic outlook, or at least allows for the development of that in some sense. What is more, a position of common ground, okay, between religions, and at least in this sense, that panentheism, this intimacy the concept imagines, can be found in different dimensions across religious traditions. And this is something that Phil Clayton and others have pointed to in a real way. Okay, but what about the non-religious? Okay, if you belong to no religion as well, panentheism is a framework, a spiritual kind of framework that's thought to include the world's wisdom rather than simply exclude it, right? So it doesn't require, obviously, a commitment to one tradition. Arguably, again, we're going through this quickly, but these are matters that people will disagree on, but we're speaking a bit more broadly as to this vision of panentheism that emerges not just from Whitehead, but from other thinkers too. Okay, others have said it's religiously more viable in nature, right? Okay, one question would be the problem of evil, right? That these classical attributes cannot be situated together in a real sense if the reality of evil is to be affirmed. Okay, it's a big discussion. One thing we've mentioned is that the immanence, the inclusion that's in this sort of panentheistic vision is already in a position to make some ground on the problem. The fact that God feels, responds, suffers is also going to mean something different for how we think. The fact that God cannot coerce, but persuades only, means that God is not responsible for the existence of evil. I mean, maybe you might want to say, in a certain sense, God is. But if God never created a world, then there would be no evil. But you wouldn't be here either to complain about it. Okay. All right, so this is a deep participatory model. All right. God is not to be sought outside of the world of experience, but God is found there where religious communion is a reality. Okay, finally, some have said that panentheism has better ethical or political implications. Okay, this is an important point, especially given our climate, political climate. Traditionally, like the divine right of kings is an exemplification. We model our political sphere off a divine monarch. It's going to be incredibly damaging. More recently, with the notion that God has this option, preferential option for one group of people rather than another, one great country rather than another. And if that's the case, there's certain license to invade, to coerce, right? The image of God filters into culture, right, in a very significant way. Let us just be reminded that Whitehead is not thinking about a divine monarch. He uses the language of companionship, even friendship. Okay, we should also mention passivity, okay, regarding the ecological crisis, especially, has often been linked to certain understandings of God as outside the world, God as leaving the world behind. You think of the sort of Left Behind series of books. Okay, but if the world is God's body, that means the world is God's sacred dwelling place. And as such, it's going to demand sacred respect, proper stewardship. Right? So it's been argued that panentheism is a model that really houses this ability in a significant